All right, so thank you very much for joining us in our third seminar of this semester's seminar series. For those of you who have missed our previous seminars, the good news is you can find the uh, recordings of those seminars on our website, sail-lab.org. Now, today we have my PhD student with us. Um, Let me see there. Everything seems to be fine. Okay, so we have my PhD student with us, soon to be, in the relative sense, Dr. Nancirose Piazza, who is a researcher at the Secured and Assured Intelligent Learning, or SAIL lab. She holds a Bachelor of Science degree in mathematics, and she just completed her master's degree in data science at UNH. Her current research interests include the security challenges and vulnerabilities of algorithmic trading based on deep reinforcement learning and the formal analysis of adversarial imitation learning attacks against sensitive RL policies. Nancy, thank you so very much for accepting our invitation. Before you begin, I must add a quick note that this project was done in collaboration with the Royal Bank of Canada and Dr. Ali Fathi, who is I believe, the Vice President for Risk Modeling and Risk Management, or AI Risk Management, in Royal Bank of Canada. And this is a continuing collaboration. Uh, Nancy has been one of the key members of this research project, and I'm looking forward to her presentation. Nancy, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you so much for that introduction, Zaid. As you know, I'm Nancirose Piazza, and I'll be giving a presentation on threat modeling for deep reinforcement trading agents or algorithms to adversarial attacks. So, um, okay, so let me give you some background to what reinforcement learning is. Reinforcement learning is learning to interact with environment through experience. So this experience requires trial and error, and the objective of reinforcement learning is to obtain an optimal policy, which is a mapping from states to actions that that maximize an objective. And this objective in this particular case is called the maximum expected utility. So reinforcement learning is built upon a fundamental mathematical framework called the Markov decision process. It's a discrete stochastic decision-making process. And this is you can say, you can think of it as like a computer, where computers are made of components. And when these components are working together, they can produce a solution, which is what we call the policy, or sometimes just the agent. So in reinforcement learning, we have two general concepts or objects. We have the agent and we have the environment. An agent can take actions and interact with the environment, and this environment will then return as the next state, as well as the reward for taking a particular action at a given state. When it comes to reinforcement learning, there are these things or values called state values, which are associated with that tell the agent how good it is to be in a particular state. And there are also Q values, which are another set of values which tell you how good it is to take a particular action given a particular state. So the solutions to obtain an optimal policy, there are two general solutions that are used. There's the methodology where we find the converged state values and then we extract an optimal policy from these state values. Or we do not try to search for state values and we directly search for a policy that will maximize the expected utility. Deep reinforcement learning is just reinforcement learning, but with a neural network as the function approximator for part of the solution. So for example, in reinforcement learning, we have something called Q learning. It is learning the state action pairs. So you can think of it as a table and they're assigned values. And then when an agent sees a state or the environment gives the agent a state, it will pick the best action for that particular state across all the actions available at a particular state. So deep Q learning is the same idea, but instead of a Q table, we just use a function approximator as the table instead. So it takes in a state and outputs an action. So why deep reinforcement learning in trading? Well, if you've been alive for the last 10 years, reinforcement neural networks have become very popular as the method of automation. High frequency trading is the automation of large volumes and fast intervals of trading. For traders, it'd be very beneficial for them if they could trade quickly and yeah. So and because of this, right, there are the traditional methodologies to automation, which are machine learning techniques, usually just neural networks in general, but their objective is classification. The benefit to reinforcement learning in general is that this is a decision-making framework. So it is able to incorporate or to consider future actions and future states. So this is extremely interesting and valuable to traders because that is much like trading. Yeah. But the traditional reinforcement learning uses a tabular setting. So that means that the state action pairs, the Q values, are often just discrete. So they're literal pairs in a table. And this can grow exponentially. So instead, we use a function approximator in order to reduce the amount of state action pairs that we would need to literally save. And sometimes along function approximators, neural networks are really good at feature engineer high dimensional data, and they're good at generalization. So when we put reinforcement learning and deep neural networks together, we get kind of like the best of both worlds. But there are immediate problems when it comes to deep reinforcement learning, just in the same as neural networks in general. Why? Because neural networks, or deep architectures as they're called, are susceptible to adversarial attacks. So here in this picture, we have a picture of a panda. So the picture of a panda, you can think of it as the state of the agent. So this is the state. And then the classification that you see that says panda can be the action that it takes. So this is, you can think of it as the state and outcomes in action. And then if you add just a little bit of noise, so in this picture, the noise is amplified so that we can see it. But when it comes to actually visualization of it, it probably would not be detectable to your eyes. Once that's added onto the picture, it still looks like a panda, but now it has a very different action or a very different classification. And as that example holds, does this apply to deep reinforcement trading agents? Yes. In the analogy I just gave, the actions are exactly the classifications, and the states are the data, the raw data that is input into the neural network. So what are an adversary's intentions? Why and how? Well, it's very difficult to address these specifically, but if we can threat model it, it could be easier for a lot of people moving forward who want to implement and deploy these deep reinforcement trading agents into the wild, as we say. But be aware of the securities and the caveats to these models that exist. So I'm going to borrow from the computer security domain a very infamous triad called the CIA. This stands for confidentiality, integrity, and availability. This is usually are the principles that a defender wants to preserve and protect, but this is also what an adversary wants to violate. So an adversary will aim to violate at least one of these three components or more. So they will want to violate the confidentiality of the model. A lot of these models, as they're intellectual properties. It's actually really expensive to train these agents. So violating or compromising the intellectual property means that, well, someone has just made money off of your work. Yeah, that can be pulled into a legal court, but it's very difficult, at least in the cyber domain. Privacy of training or testing data. Well, your agents have to be trained on some sort of data, right, to generalize. But sometimes this data is very private. It's either private or it has sensitive data. And unfortunately, these agents or these neural networks, when they make these decision boundaries, they can preserve some of the sensitive data inside of the neural network's parameters. So things like for a trading agent, the balance can be exposed, so how much money is in their security, personal identified information, and sometimes the history, like so if they have like a transaction history in the observational space, that's very dangerous. And then an adversary can also violate the integrity of the predictions. Well, as you saw before, the agent was extremely confident in predicting that panda was a gibbon. But as we oversee this neural network and this algorithm, we don't trust the output. And so how much can we put our trust into these agents for their predictions? Are they at all resilient or robust against these adversarial attacks? That's something we have to discuss. And now availability of the agent. The availability agent can either be of the form of the agent's service, as in like the ability just to take action, see a state and take an action, or it could be compromising the system's host itself. So the host that's holding the agent or hosting the agent. So this could be an endpoint. For a trader, this means that if their agent is out of commission, they aren't trading and they're losing value and money because their money is technically still. So now we're going to get to the actual threat model of how we will oversee what an adversary can do in this landscape. So adversarial attacks are inevitable, but using a trading DRL threat models, we can outline channel attacks that properly provide us some sort of formation or format such we can mitigate damages and predict where an adversary may decide to attack. The attacks here in this particular image to the right is it outlines two specific test time attacks, but they're not exclusively test time. The reward channel and the actuary channel can also be attacked. We don't explicitly go through particular types, but they're very of similar nature. The input channels here we have, so these input channels are our data monitor channels. These are usually like, you can say they're hosted from another site about stock market values, and then they're interacting through an API. Then your application is pulling information from that API through the API. And then it takes these values, turns them into a feature, and this is called the state space, or as for classification, this would just be the feature space. And then this feature or the state is sent to the agent, so the policy, and the policy will have to decide or predict an action to take. And then after predicting the action, now there's the question of whether or not this action actually gets implemented into the environment, or if this is, or if is intercepted in between and is not actually able to be acted upon. We have the external security diagram also included in here because a reinforcement learning agent will also have to learn to, in order to buy stocks, they also have to be able to have some sort of security to pull from in order to make these transactions. Yeah. So this threat model is formulated from a more general threat model for deep reinforcement learning agents proposed by Bezidon. This one's more specific for trading agents, but it has a very similar overall feel for how we'll define our threat model. An adversary's budget is also a very important part to any threat model. It is the measurement of an adversary's resource to successfully performing an attack. So whatever specific attack or objective they have, they will need some sort of budget in order to obtain or to successfully perform their attack. In this diagram, we have two attacks here. One's called denial of service, and the other one's called man in the middle. So I also have to give you a little bit of a background of how a lot of these kind of attacks they have properties. They can be many types of properties, but they also may be exclusively one property and not another. So there are two types of attacks as we'll go through. There are the targeted and the non-targeted attacks. So a targeted attack is when an attack causes an agent to take an adversarial action. So this action was decided by the adversary instead of its true optimal action at a particular time step. Non-targeted is that any other action but the optimal action at that time step is taken. There are white box and black box attacks. This is more specific to the computer science domain, but we're pulling it from there. So there's also there's variations in between, but generally we would say white box attacks occur when enough adversarial information or knowledge of the target agent is known, such that they can craft adversarial attacks. So specifically like white box optimization attacks for neural networks. Then there are black box attacks, which is the case where there is not enough information for the adversary to craft an attack, right? So they're going to be somewhat blind to how they're going to do it, but they have direct or indirect accessibility to the agent, so they may work by using passive attacks. There are active and passive attacks. Active attacks, the intentions for an active attack is to change the agent's trajectory or the action at a particular state. So this is intervention. Passive attacks are the intention to gather adversary information on the target agent. So like man in the middle, it intercepts, or packet sniffing, it intercepts these state values, but they don't actually swap out these values. Then there are test time attacks and training time attacks. Test time attacks this is also called an inference attack. Not an inference attack, but a test time attack is when an agent, that there's an attack on an agent that is using a fixed, already learned policy. So this is usually the case of most settings of how we will be viewing going forward. So all the ones that we'll be talking about in this presentation will be test time attacks. But there are also another set of attacks called training time attacks, or they're also known as data poisoning attacks. This is an attack on the agent during its training phase. As it sounds, it's a more complicated system to threat model, because now we're talking about learning of the agent, but it's something that future researchers should consider. So active test time attacks. So here we're going to be presenting two active test time attacks that are actually quite known in computer vision. It's called the fast gradient sign method and the Carlini and Wagner attack, CW. So the example of the panda that I showed before is exactly an example of an FGSM attack. It is a relatively cheap adversarial attack. It's quick. It tends to have a lower success rate because of its blindness of how it finds an adversarial attack. But for an adversary, this is still relatively beneficial, because even if a weak attack works, then the budget doesn't have to be particularly large. Now, what does this look like for an actual trading agent? Well, here we have in this diagram a few columns. We have X, X prime, A, and A prime. X is going to be a tuple of 3 values. So this is the relative high, relative low, and relative close price. In the corner, you see the relative high formula. That's how they're kind of constructed. So you can kind of get an idea that these values aren't particularly large. They're relatively, you can say relatively bounded, but they're not exactly bounded. So they're not box constrained. X prime, which is the actual perturbation of X that we induce some sort of perturbation upon, and we swap out the tuple. Now, as you can see, the original action, which is A1, that's for the first one. Let's say it means that the agent should have bought a stock at a particular time step. But by swapping out with X prime, that's very similar in value, we can change the action to wait. In this particular example, this is a very simple DQN. So the action space that is available, that is discrete, is small. So there's only wait, buy, and sell, and these all wait, buy, and sell on one particular stock. But more complex agents can buy larger stocks, as well as has a much larger action space. So observational delay. So this is very much like denial of service attack. It really depends on how it's implemented in the system to determine the budget. So observational delay is an attack on the observation channel, as mean it is an attack on the state space. A tuple is originally received at a time step t, but is instead seen at a future time step, t+1. We choose t+1, or just a time step of 1, because this is the most minimum amount of possible delay possible. So we can think of this as what is the expectation of damage can be done to these agents with just the bare minimum amount of either budget or interference. So we see here on the left side, we have the basic DQN, which has a very simple environment that any of the agents that have any sort of delay or a chance at being delayed perform suboptimally to the non-attacked agent. On the right, we actually have an agent here that's more complicated. This agent has 181 discrete actions, different sizes of tradings to buy. Also, it has a expected risk. It has expected it takes parameters or more specific parameters to trading that help avoid or to mitigate losses in case that there is well, there's always risk involved when it comes to trading. So these help maximize, this helps minimize the amount of risk that's being taken. So on the right, even though it looks like visually that they're very similar, which they are, but if we look at the intervals on the left, we're actually talking about really large numbers here. So if you can imagine these values being losses in monetary gain, they're not exactly monetary gains. This is total reward, and this reward function is not necessarily equivalent to monetary gains, but this is a representation of monetary gains. So you can imagine that there's a huge impact of losing potential maximization of monetary gain. So now we have the more specific non-targeted and non-targeted FGSM and non-targeted CW attacks. We have some examples of what they look like. You can see that they really don't differ in values too much. So as an expectation, that means these agents that we attacked are actually relatively fragile and not robust to adversarial attacks. On the bottom half, we have the failure rates. And it really depends on how we define a failure, but for at least non-targeted attacks, it's simple enough that if the action is not diverted to a different action, then it's a failure. Although speaking, the basic DQN had a much lower failure rate, and the more complicated DQN has a much higher failure rate. But it still shows that it can still be impacted by these attacks. And so this is the visualization of what happens. Again, like before, you can see that any of the agents that are being perturbed or being attacked upon at any particular chance relatively do worse than the agent that doesn't get induced by these attacks. And the worse it gets, it can be associated with higher chances of being attacked. On the bottom half, we have the reward difference. So the reward difference means that if we see a straight line across at 0, that means there is no reward difference between the optimal or the agent not being attacked and then the agent induced by an attack. So as that means is that if any of these lines go underneath the straight horizontal line at 0, they are losing reward measured in the reward function. That means that any of these attacks are potentially losing monetary gains and fruition. So now what's more important to these traders is that even though you're measuring it in reward, that doesn't necessarily measure to the actual amount of money that they're losing, which is tied to their security and network. So we take a look at TensorTrade, which has implemented a ability to also check the network of the agent. So we take a look at that, and we can see that these agents actually do lose money in corresponding to the reward function. But also, the reward function actually doesn't fully represent what is happening to the agent's security. On the right side, we see that there's some odd behaviors, even though on the previous slide, we saw all of these performances decrease. But on the right, it seems that there's money or network that's being gained and lost, which is not being reflected in the reward function. So now more specifically, we'll be talking about the targeted FGSM and targeted CW. Like before, These particular agents aren't specifically normalized. So the values of these state spaces, they tend to be for at least these kind of adversarial attacks, they tend to be boxed. So meaning they're normalized between 0 and 1, and the values attack within these ranges. But these trading agents tend to use indicators or values that aren't. They have much higher variance and they aren't normalized. What that means is that implementation to these, I'm sorry, hold on. With that, sorry, okay. So what that means for a trading agent is that it's actually much harder to standardize these adversarial attacks to these agents. It can be done to a degree, but it might be much easier. There's a trade-off to whether or not the readability, or you can say the interpretability of some of these values for traders who are overseeing these agents should be considered as part as the threat model or not. On the right, you see that the FGSM target attacks are usually less successful, mainly because it does specifically have a particular action in mind. And when you have a really large action space, it may be extremely difficult to be successful in obtaining a particular adversary action. But it depends on how you define the adversarial action. For the simple basic DQN, there's only 3 actions, so it's pretty standard. If it doesn't match the action, then it should be considered a failure. But for the more complicated DQN, because it's 181 action spaces and they all are, you can think of them as distributed across buy, sell, and wait actions. Well, there's only one wait action, but buy and sell, that maybe considering the type of action that occurs may be enough for an adversary to be considered partially successful or not. This is same as before, just some examples of what they look like. Visually, right? We look at these values and then we place, let's say the first one, these values aren't particularly off. You wouldn't think they would be, you wouldn't think that a neural network would change their course of action due to this, but as you can see, 0, which is the wait action for the complicated or the tensor trade DQN, is 0. But then we can change it to an adversary action, which is 144, which ends up being, if I recall correctly, that might be a sell. Oh, yes, that is a sell action. So true successful attacks on these agents really depend on how an adversary defines success. But at least under this circumstance, there's some benefit to target attacks if we loosen or if we generalize our criteria for success. Otherwise, this is all partial success. Another and more visualization on what this looks like. Again, the performance gets degraded because of adversarial attacks. The reward function differences, as described here, they look like before. They're all deteriorating. So if a straight line, that means they're doing just as well as the agent not being attacked, but otherwise they are receiving less maximization of reward. Now, this is the interesting part as well for the networked for tensor trade. When we take a look at their network differences, targeted attacks may be actually more useful in determining of how the behavior of the reward function, what shows through the reward function, may be more related to the actual underlying security gain or losses. Mainly because this is targeted attacks, and if they're successful at any particular time, they might have more predictability and impact. So after we talked about active test time attacks, now we have to talk about passive test time attacks. So man in the middle attack is a passive test time attack. How can we observe trajectories to be used by an adversary? Okay, so if an adversary decides to intercept or passes, or you can say packet sniff, particular states that are being passed through an application, this we'll be assuming are experiences. We're going to be calling these experiences because we'll be seeing their states. And then we're also going to assume that at some point we can see the whole trajectory. So for now, we're going to assume we can observe the entire trajectory of a particular episode without interruption. So if an observation, if observation or these particular values that are being intercepted contain sensitive data, such as the balance, this can be valuable. Now, what can be done or what has been talked about to discuss these kind of problems? Well, differential privacy is an area of research or a topic on how we can preserve or personal and identifiable information or information on a person in the data, meaning that they are not distinguishable if they were not included in the training data. So can people's information be compromised from observation interception? Yes. Language models are known to be very susceptible to preserving sensitive information in their neural networks, and you can extract sensitive data from the networks, the network. Yeah. So if observations can train, if these observations can be used to train another policy that is like the target policy, an adversary can technically use this model or this newly trained policy to attack it and then try to transfer these attacks to the target agents. This is something that we would consider transferability of adversarial attacks. What they mean is that we can implement more white box-like attacks to the target agent, so they're not as black boxed. This allows an adversary to gain information on the target policy architecture for stronger attacks. If an observation can be used to train another policy that an adversary can directly make or use to make profit, this is much like before, where it's intellectual property. When we talk about whether or not an adversary can imitate a target policy, we're going to be calling this policy imitation. But there's actually another branch of learning called imitation learning that is, in the naive sense, addresses leveraging demonstration or existing demonstrations so that it can be used for training agents. But used adversarially, we can use the observations that we intercepted from the target agents to train our agents. And we follow this perspective on adversarial use of IL methods from Bezadan and Hisu. So imitation learning. Imitation learning is the learning to imitate an expert policy through demonstrations. Behavioral clones are supervised learners that match demonstrations, and imitation learning plus reinforcement learning. So when they're used together, the objective for that is to obtain a policy that is as good or outperforms the expert demonstrations. What this means is that there's basically two, you can think of it as objectives in imitation learning. A lot of behavioral clones tend to imitate the expert in trying to exactly match their performance. And then there's the other one objective, which is usually meant for learning the underlying task, which goes hand in hand like with meta learning. So we'll be looking at a particular imitation learning variant called DQFD, Deep Q Learning from Demonstrations. The initial usage of DQFD is to mitigate early stages of training. What this means is that off-policy agents, or these are agents in order to learn more of the state space, they have to explore. And when there's exploration or stochastic behavior policy, this often leads to destructive behaviors during learning. And when it comes to, let's say, training a robot, that may not be possible, or that may be extremely expensive because they may be breaking an arm every 2 seconds. This happens usually in the beginning of training, and this is called the optimistic initialization. So the basic idea behind DQFD is to, one, train an agent on demonstrations that we assume to be optimal, and we call it the pre-training phase. And then two, after the training phase, you let the agent interact with the environment to generate its own experiences. It'll learn off of the expert experience, but also on its own experiences. However, it will prioritize the expert's experience. So a little more specific to DQFD, DQFD has a particular type of loss, crafted loss, is the sum of 4 types of losses. There's the WDQN one-step look-ahead loss. There's the WDQN 10-step look-ahead loss. So 10 is just the relative number that they picked in the original paper. It could be any variation to the terminal state. And then we have a supervised margin loss, which means it will penalize the agent from taking actions that are different from the experts. And then we have L2 regularization, which is usually used in neural networks in general to avoid overfitting. Lambdas, as you can see, lambda 1, 2, 3, 4 are all just scalars. They're used just for, you can say, fine tuning for better agents for any particular environment. WDQN loss is defined as this, but it's not really too important to define unless you wanted to look at the paper. So now we going to show some graphs about the performance on the imitated agents versus the target agent. So in red on the left, we have the target agent. These are randomizations, or you can think of average. These are for the top graphs. These are the average gains or network gains for the target agent over a particular set of randomization starts. So you can think of it as randomly selecting time steps and then performing a fixed number amount of time steps and recording these performances and then averaging. So the target agent has a really wide box plot. The rest of them to the right, except for the one on the most right, which is the supervising or the behavior clone, are all DQFD agents. These are the amount of time steps that they are trained on. So that means 250 times, that means 250 interceptions of demonstrations from the target agent and so forth. As we can see there, it's quite difficult to compare the performance when it comes to these agents because the environment is extremely complex. But it is important to consider that there's still somewhat within these ranges of performances that some of these agents can actually perform better. So we have here on the bottom we have a count on the number of actions that match with the target agent. So this we can think of as almost like an ability to see how similar particular action, given a particular state, would these actions match for the target agent and the imitated agents. For the behavior clone, which is the most promising for the training evaluation, because it actually says what it was trained on, it very closely matches the demonstrations or the expert policy specifically. When it comes to the randomization evaluation, though, these are time steps that are outside of training. So these you can think of as test time evaluations, as they would do for traditional supervised learners. But comparison on how well they can imitate few time steps they have never seen before is actually extremely difficult to measure. But the action similarity is something to note, because maybe it doesn't have to be enough, or maybe it's just enough that a lot of the action types are very similar, that you don't actually need the exact action to take. So now we have to talk about imperfect demonstrations. So before we assumed we had full trajectories. These full trajectories are not interrupted, so that this whole sequence can be thought of as a chain. Imperfect demonstrations, we can think of it as particular time steps that have been intercepted, but they're not necessarily continuous. Are these demonstrations at all useful to an adversary? We can't expect them to imitate the target agent because that's actually quite difficult, even with a full continuous set of demonstrations. But can they still be competitive? Yes, they can still be competitive. Here on the left, we have the target agent, which is in red, and then underneath it, you can see that even with an agent that is not trained on a lot of the target agent demonstrations, as long as it can interact with the environment itself, it finds its own set of state action pairs and policy such that it can outperform the target agent in this particular case. On the right side, we look at the network, and again, the values are somewhat within some range, right? But it's quite interesting that some agents can actually have a smaller range of loss, or you can think of it as the spread for the box plot. So now we have to talk about transferability. So when we talk about transferability, this is usually using, so an adversary has trained an imitated agent, they attack their agent, and now they want to intercept or use man-in-the-middle attack to now swap these values out for the target agent's state space. So this is an active test time attack. It requires interception like man-in-the-middle. So how susceptible is the target agent to white box optimization attacks that were successful to the imitated agent? In other words, we're going to show these, in this particular example, we have an imitated agent, we show it as state. if we perform an attack on this state and is it successful to the imitated agent, then we will show it to the target agent. That's how we define successful attack and a successful transfer here. Here we have the 250, 350, all the way up to 500 as the same agents before, meaning these are the fully trained DQFD agents. So they've gone through the pre-training phase and they've gone through exploration, interaction with the environment themselves. We also have a set of agents below it, which are just the pre-train phase. You can think of this as sort of as an imitation learning technique, right? But without the actual ability to interact with the environment. So that's a very interesting, another concept that might be very interesting for an adversary, because if their objective is not to actually use the model themselves, maybe they don't even need the environment itself, but just enough of the architecture and insight on the architecture that they can craft like observation demonstrations that they can, states that they can intercept with man in the middle. And how do we measure these budgets? Well, it really depends on how you want to define these budgets. But for now, for this particular case, you can consider it as being the cost or the passive budget cost, and then the active budget cost. So in the passive, you can think of it as the amount of demonstrations that needed to be intercepted in order to learn for the imitated agent. You might want to also add on resources for the imitated agent in order to learn. And then you will also add on the active budget, which means is the other part of swapping out these particular states for the target agent states. So one of the last few things that we'll be talking about are the expectations for reinforcement learning and DQFD for trading in general. So as mentioned before, the reward function is not exactly the underlying security. The reward function here for the tensor trade DQN uses the Sharpe ratio, which is a human interpretable financial metric index. But the question we would like to ask is whether or not this reward function, though interpretable, is this necessarily the best reward function for profit maximization? That's a question for inverse reinforcement learning. So this is a little beyond the presentation we'll be giving today. Optimal policies are conditioned to their MDPs, including the terminal state. Now, it really depends on what kind of MDP we're talking about, whether it's infinite or finite horizon, but the number of future states can actually impact on, it impacts the value and the state value of the particular state for as the Q values. So what this means is that non-stationary terminal states, so these terminal states that may change, may no longer make a current policy optimal. So it's like, you can think of it as this way. If one day, if you had a terminal state that tomorrow, you have until tomorrow to either sell all your stocks or wait. And the current price of the stock market, say $1 per stock, you would sell right now, all of it, right? But if I change that terminal state to 3 days in the future, where you know that in the second day, the prices are going to triple. So the stock prices are going to be tripled. Then you would probably wait until the second day to sell all your stocks, or the third day, either way, right? It depends on the price for that day. But so that means that the policy in itself can be very non-stationary, specifically depending on the terminal state. So DQFD, regarding our test for producing competitive agents at a less cost, it does its job, right? Because we saw that we can produce some agents that perform competitively, if not better. It is possible, right? But it is extremely difficult to measure similarities to the target agents due to the MDP, which usually depends on how complex and the environment's dynamics are. So this requires evaluation through querying the target policy for distribution of shift. What this means is that if a imitated agent decides to go and take a different trajectory than the target agent, because the target agent never visited that particular trajectory, we would need access to that target agent to show it those particular states that it has never actually encountered during its true trajectory. So both DQFD agents and behavior clones through supervised learning agents provide an adversary with stronger white box attacks. So one more commentary about trading deep reinforcement agents. These agents are neural networks, and they're both susceptible and robust at the same time when it comes to optimization attacks. They're robust because convolutional neural networks are said to be more robust. They are robust because a single tuple of values may not even change the output of the target agent. As we saw before, it wasn't very successful in some cases where it was inserted. However, on the same note, it can be very successful because if a man-in-the-middle attack is successful, that perturbation is preserved inside the moving window until it's out of the observation space. So that means it stays in there for another, let's say if you have a window of 50 time steps, then it's there for another 50 time steps, and it can impact 50 time steps into the future. And this could be a waterfall cascading effect, because if it can affect one and it allows a successful change of action, this would also be considered successful, and then the next perturbation will be preserved into its state space. This is also successful because these dimensions, because there are moving windows, certain dimensions can be more susceptible or sensitive to perturbations. Yeah, that can be examined through a little bit of like a sailing map, but even that is difficult to estimate on how it impacts for future perturbations. So what can be done for this problem with deep reinforcement learning trading agents? Well, as we showed in this presentation, we can threat model it, and we lay down quite a bit of outlining of that space from the original general framework that can be used specifically for trading. We can also develop new mitigation algorithms or defenses against adversarial and passive adversarial attacks. If we have an active test time attack, what can be done? Well, we can train models with adversarial data. This is actually known as adversarial training, to harden and make the agent more resilient against specific types of adversarial attacks, so the ones that they were trained on. We have passive test time attacks. Well, right now we're working on a mitigation algorithm called the constraint randomization of policy. This is current research, and you'll be seeing that in the future, hopefully. Yeah. So third, talking about sensitive information. So these agents are trained on sensitive data most of the time, if not a lot of the time. Can we obfuscate these values enough to protect the information underlying it, or make it in differential privacy non-distinguishable, but not impair the performance of these agents? Well, there are works in differential private DP in RL through noise that addresses very similar ideas. Do data poisoning attacks and standardized learning also transfer to DRL? Yes, right? You can think of any adversarial attacks can be transferable to reinforcement learnings, but their compounding errors are much more difficult to estimate because this is a decision-making task. Are there defenses against this? Yes, learning with noisy demonstration labels or with noise in general is very similar to some types of data poisoning attacks, and or can help be in resilience against adversarial attacks like these. Now, with existing works, can the theoretical analysis of these works be used in threat modeling? Yeah, so a lot of these works or a lot of these algorithms that are introduced, they have some sort of theoretical analysis for its learning capability, such that it is either more sample efficient or something like that. That usually is for the benefit or for the usage of this algorithm. Now, for threat modeling, this can be used in some way to help either forward a particular type of analysis for whether or not we should focus towards a particular part of the threat modeling, or if it's not really as promising, that it may not even be worth as much resources as we may have thought so. In conclusion, we have shown that deep reinforcement trading agents are susceptible to adversarial attacks and can fool humans who manage these algorithms. We have outlined a threat model structured for trading agents based on a deep reinforcement learning trading model by Bezadan. We have addressed possible adversarial objectives and expectations on algorithms that may or may not optimize the objective. We discussed commentary on the expectation of deep reinforcement trading agents and possible issues with RL under trading domain. So this is the talk about the reward function, whether or not this reward function is proper for its maximization objective. We discuss existing areas of research that can be used for threat modeling, trading for current and future areas of research. And these are the references. Yeah.
See, thank you so very much for this excellent presentation. Believe it or not, even though I'm a co-author in this work and your advisor, I learned a few new things as well. So well done. I'm going to open the floor to any questions that the audience might have.
Don't be shy now.
Chris?
Hello, Nancy. This is Chris.
Hi,
Thank
Chris.
you for presenting. I
Thank
had
you
a
for
couple
listening.
questions
Sure.
about like tensor trade. You said
Mhm.
that it's possible to exfiltrate some sensitive data, possibly.
Mhm.
What kind of, I know you talked about features, but what kind of features may be included in there that are like private? Because usually I think of, like whenever I think about somebody on Wall Street, like analyzing the different companies, I think of like the openly available information about the company, or do they use like user trends to determine how they're gonna invest, how, or the model uses to predict future changes?
Okay. So the answer to that is, the barest bones is that yes, they use indicators that are publicly available, right? But what makes these agents more able to learn particular, or you can say optimize faster, is when more useful features are added, right? Let's say if an agent can learn explicitly on trading stocks with just some values alone, right? Then trading wouldn't be as complicated as it is, as they say it is today. So there must be more information that's being inputted into these state spaces if you want some performance benefits. So sometimes what might be added would be the current balance for a particular, let's say, a bank account that's been added. So it's saying, oh, can they make this trade? Whether that might be needed to be informed or seen to the agent in order for it to pick an action. But they also may include, like you said before, user preferences or trends, or even underhooded. You can think of it like underhooded insight information, because as you, I don't know if you heard, but in recent, let's say a few weeks ago, Robinhood and all that, right? The problem with Wall Street and Robinhood is that now they're a lot of their information is being sold underneath. So do you expect these algorithms that, if they had an algorithm doing this, right? They would be also considering any you would say local or any future decisions that were set in, or that are like agreed upon but not technically written or publicly made. So that might be something that's input into these agents, but we have no actual clue, like in that sense, right? This is more specific to that particular agent. But if it does, any of that agent can be could possibly be compromised.
Okay, that answers my question. I was really wondering about the Robin Hood, so you kind of hit the nail on the head. That's what I was trying to figure out. So it seems like this could have some forensic benefits too, for people like the SEC trying to figure out if some of these machine learning models are legitimately using this data, or if it could be considered insider trading. I'm definitely not an
Yeah.
attorney, but it's interesting. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
That was a very interesting idea. Thank you, Chris. We now have a new customer. All right. Do we have any other questions? Very well. Nancy, once again, thank you so very much for this wonderful presentation. And I bet all of us, not just only me, will be looking forward to your upcoming results on crop and even further. And thanks to our audience for joining us
Thank you
today.
all.
We do host regular seminars. The next one is going to be next Friday, either at 2 p.m. or 3 p.m. The announcement will be made via email as well as on our website. Have a great weekend, everyone, and goodbye.
Okay, guys. Thank you for coming.
Great presentation, Nancy.